I've lived in my neighborhood for nearly 5 years now, tucked away at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with tidy lawns and identical mailboxes. When I first moved in, the houses looked like something straight out of a magazine spread. Same siding, same shutters, same mailboxes. But I liked that. Order felt comforting back then, predictable. I didn't yet understand that the same uniformity that attracted me would one day become the very thing that turned my neighbors against me. The community is run by an HOA, Homeowners Association, one of those entities that loves control more than anything. At first, I didn't have any problems with them. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard neat, and smiled at the neighbors when I passed. For years, things were peaceful. But then, last spring, I decided to do something small, something harmless, I thought, that would set everything in motion. I planted a privacy hedge along the edge of my property. That's it, just a line of evergreens, neat and trimmed, to give me a bit of separation from the common walkway behind my house. But to the HOA, that was apparently a declaration of war. Within a week, I received my first violation notice. The hedge was unauthorized landscaping, according to the letter taped to my door in bold red ink. I called thinking it was a mistake. The woman on the phone, Lisa, the HOA president, spoke like she was reading from a manual. All modifications to property boundaries must be pre-approved, she said. The hedge constitutes a boundary. Alteration. I didn't remove it. That was mistake number 1. The notices kept coming after that. One after another. Fines, warnings, threats of further action. I tried reasoning with them, even attending one of the HOA meetings, but it was like stepping into a den of bureaucratic snakes. They smiled politely, nodded, and said things like, "We'll review your request," but their eyes were cold, empty, rehearsed. I left that meeting realizing that they weren't interested in resolving anything. They wanted compliance. Months passed, and I thought maybe the feud had cooled off. I stopped getting letters. My hedge grew taller, thicker, just how I wanted it. But that peace didn't last. It began on a Wednesday morning just after dawn. I remember because I was standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise through the blinds. That's when I noticed movement outside. 2 men in reflective vests, carrying measuring tape and wooden stakes. They were pacing along the edge of my lawn, right near my hedge. I opened the window and called out, but they ignored me. When I stepped outside, they hurried off down the sidewalk like kids caught doing something wrong. Later that day, I saw faint spray-painted lines across the grass. Bright orange markings forming a crude rectangle around my property line. I had no idea what they meant. That night, I checked my email. Nothing from the HOA. No updates, no explanations. I shrugged it off, assuming maybe it was a utility marking or something routine. I had no idea that those orange lines were the first sign of what was coming. A few days later, I was woken by the sound of machinery. Loud, grinding, mechanical noise. It was barely 6 a.m. I stumbled to the window and froze. There were people outside, at least 6 of them, wearing gloves, hard hats, and HOA-branded vests. They had a small excavator parked right beside my driveway, its arm digging deep into the earth. Dirt was flying everywhere. They were digging, around my property. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of sewer work. But then, I saw where they were digging. A perfect trench, tracing those same orange lines I'd seen days earlier. The trench encircled my property like a moat. My mailbox, driveway, even the side yard, all surrounded by freshly turned soil. I rushed outside in disbelief, yelling over the roar of the excavator, asking what they thought they were doing. Nobody answered. One man, an older guy with a clipboard, just said, "This is HOA business, sir," before turning his back on me. That phrase stuck with me, HOA business. By noon, they'd finished the job. They packed up, left, and there it was, a 4-foot-deep trench running around my entire yard. A literal trench. My house looked like it had been isolated from the rest of the neighborhood by a ring of dirt. I didn't know whether to laugh or panic. I took photos, of course, dozens of them, and emailed the HOA demanding an explanation. Hours later, I received their official statement. According to them, the trench was a drainage improvement project necessary for community water flow management. They claimed it just happened to follow my property line. That made no sense. The slope of the neighborhood ran in the opposite direction. There was no drainage issue here. It was obvious what this was. Retaliation. That night, standing in my yard under the porch light, I looked at that trench and felt something I hadn't before, real anger. I realized I wasn't just dealing with paperwork bullies anymore. They had crossed into something physical, destructive, and deeply personal. That's when I remembered my cameras, a few months earlier. I'd installed a set of security cameras, motion-activated, high-definition, with night vision, after a string of car break-ins had happened nearby. I hadn't checked the footage in weeks, but I suddenly wondered what they might have caught during the dig. I went inside, logged into the system, and pulled up the recordings from that morning. What I saw made my stomach turn. The HOA members weren't just supervising. They were directing the digging crew, pointing, measuring, and laughing. In one clip, I saw Lisa herself, the HOA president, standing with a clipboard, waving her hands in big circles as if giving orders. Another member, a man named Greg, who lived 2 houses down, was shown driving the excavator himself. There was no sign of any city inspectors, no utility vans, no official documentation. This wasn't a drainage project. It was deliberate sabotage disguised as community maintenance. I sat there, replaying the footage over and over, each time feeling my frustration deepen. They had done this in broad daylight, right in front of my cameras, completely confident that I wouldn't, or couldn't, do anything about it. But they were wrong. The next day, I started making calls. To the county office, to the city's zoning department, to anyone who would listen. I filed a complaint, submitted the footage as evidence, and waited. But if I thought that would stop the HOA, I was mistaken, because within 48 hours of me reporting them, I received a letter hand-delivered to my door. It wasn't from the county or the city. It was from the HOA marked Urgent Notice. Inside, it stated that my property was now under investigation for non-compliance with community maintenance standards. They were accusing me of violating regulations related to soil erosion and unauthorized modification to drainage pathways. In other words, they were blaming me for the trench they had dug. I laughed at first, a bitter, humorless laugh. Then I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. They were trying to bury me in paperwork, fines, and false claims until I gave up. But they didn't know I had the recordings. They didn't know I had proof of every shovel of dirt they'd moved. That night, I uploaded the footage to a private drive, backed it up to a second hard disk, and even emailed copies to myself. Something told me this was far from over. The HOA had drawn their line in the dirt, literally. But now I was drawing mine, and I wasn't backing down. When I woke the next morning, the trench was still there, silent, gaping, and cruelly precise. It wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. It was a message. A boundary not just of soil, but of power. The HOA had made it clear. They could reach into my life whenever they wanted, and I was supposed to stay quiet, but I couldn't unsee the footage. Every shovel, every smirk on their faces, every mocking gesture as they desecrated my property, it played in my head like a broken film reel. They hadn't even tried to hide it. That arrogance burned deeper than the trench itself. That morning I made coffee but didn't drink it. My hands were too restless. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the printed copy of the letter they'd left me the day before, the one accusing me of creating a drainage hazard. My eyes traced each word, the bureaucratic tone dripping with condescension. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $150 until resolved. It was almost laughable, the audacity of it. But I knew how these organizations operated. They thrived on intimidation, on the hope that ordinary homeowners would rather pay than fight. I wasn't ordinary. I spent that morning compiling everything: photos, timestamps, emails, video clips, and even the HOA's so-called drainage project notice. I put them in a labeled folder, digital and physical, and sent copies to the county zoning board, city code enforcement, and the HOA's own legal representative. If they wanted a fight, I'd make sure there was a paper trail so long they couldn't wriggle out of it. But by noon, I realized something strange. The neighborhood felt off. Usually I'd hear kids playing, sprinklers running, dogs barking. But that day, silence hung in the air. Even the few cars passing by seemed to slow when they reached my house, drivers sneaking glances at the trench. My neighbors didn't wave anymore. They avoided eye contact. By evening, I knew why. A post had appeared on the community forum, our neighborhood's private message board, where the HOA made announcements and residents shared updates. It was titled Drainage Violation Update, Homeowner Non-Compliance. There it was, my address, right at the top. The post claimed that I had illegally tampered with community drainage systems and refused cooperation with approved maintenance contractors. It ended with a line that made my stomach twist. The HOA is taking necessary measures to protect community safety. They were trying to humiliate me publicly. The replies flooded in fast, neighbors thanking the HOA for addressing the issue, others speculating about flooding, erosion, or safety hazards. Nobody asked for my side of the story. Nobody questioned the absurdity of a private homeowner digging a trench around his own property. The narrative was set, and I was the villain. That night, as I sat in the darkened living room, I realized this was no longer about property lines or hedges. This was about control, about making an example out of me, but they'd underestimated how far I'd go when cornered. The next morning, I went to the city offices in person. I met with a zoning official named Carter, an older man with weary eyes and the patience of someone who's seen far too many HOA disputes. I handed him a flash drive with the footage. He didn't say much at first, just watched, quietly, the scenes of the trench being dug, Lisa giving orders, Greg operating the excavator, the rest of the crew marking measurements. After a few minutes, he sighed. "You're right," he said. "They didn't file any permits for this work." That sentence was like oxygen after suffocation. Finally, validation. He promised to file an official investigation and to send an inspector out to verify the damage. But he also warned me, once the HOA finds out the city's involved, things might get difficult. These boards can be vindictive. He wasn't wrong. The retaliation began almost immediately. 3 days later, I received a notice about my lawn. Excessive overgrowth, they called it. My grass was barely 3 inches high. The next day, another letter, this one claiming my hedge obstructed community visibility. Then came one about my garbage bin placement. Then my mailbox height. Even the color of my porch light. Every morning brought a new accusation, a new fine. It was relentless, calculated harassment disguised as enforcement. But I didn't react. Not yet. I let them pile it all on, knowing every piece of paper would become evidence later. In the meantime, the city inspector came by. He walked the property, measured the trench, took photos, and asked a few quiet questions. When I showed him the HOA's drainage notice, he frowned and said it looked forged. That same day, he ordered a temporary stop to all HOA-initiated construction in the neighborhood until the investigation concluded. I thought that would slow them down. It didn't. 2 nights later, I caught movement on my cameras again, around 1 a.m. flashlights, 2 figures near the trench. They weren't working, though. They were filling it with cement. I watched on the feed as they poured quickset concrete into sections of the trench, sealing off parts closest to the sidewalk. They moved fast, whispering, careful not to look directly at my cameras. One of them wore the same reflective vest I'd seen before, the HOA's maintenance logo faintly, visible under the flashlight. They were trying to hide what they'd done. Downloaded the footage immediately and called the non-emergency police line. By the time an officer arrived, the workers were gone, but the evidence wasn't. The cement was still wet, uneven, streaked with shovel marks. The officer listened, took my statement, and said they'd file a vandalism report. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it meant there'd be an official record beyond the HOA's control. The next morning, the HOA board sent a new letter, hand-delivered again. This time it wasn't typed. It was handwritten, angry, and brief. Cease all further interference with community maintenance. You are in violation of your homeowner agreement. Continued disruption will result in legal escalation. No signature, no name, just the HOA's embossed letterhead. That was the moment I stopped being scared. They'd dug the trench. They'd lied, retaliated, and defaced my property. and now they were trying to erase the evidence. But I had the recordings, the daytime footage, the nighttime footage, the timestamps, and every letter they'd ever sent. I uploaded everything, every clip, every photo, to a private YouTube account under an alias. It wasn't public yet, but I was preparing it. I wrote captions, descriptions, and titles that told the story in sequence. I wasn't just going to fight them legally. I was going to expose them publicly if they pushed me one step further, and then, 1 week later, they did. I came home from work to find a bright red notice stapled to my front door. Final warning, property foreclosure hearing. According to the HOA, I owed $12,475 in unpaid fines and fees. They were moving to seize my home. The trench around my yard might as well have been a moat around a castle under siege. I stood there on the porch, reading that notice again and again, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Because what they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly know, was that while they were digging trenches, I'd been digging something deeper, proof, documentation, a timeline of their corruption, and now it was time to use it. The letter on my door stayed there longer than I intended. I didn't take it down right away. I just stared at it, the red ink bleeding faintly into the paper under the morning dew. Final warning, property foreclosure hearing. It looked like a threat disguised as formality, but it was more than that. It was a declaration of war. The HOA had escalated beyond fines, beyond harassment. Now they wanted my home. The first thing I did was photograph the letter from every angle, timestamp, and all. Then I emailed it, along with my entire evidence folder, to the county code enforcement officer, to Carter, the zoning official who'd helped me before, and to a property law attorney I found online who specialized in HOA abuse cases. The attorney, a man named Patterson, called me back that afternoon. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that made you feel like you were finally not alone in the fight. He told me that what the HOA was attempting bordered on fraud, especially if they were using falsified fines and unapproved construction as grounds for foreclosure. He advised me to attend the hearing, but warned me not to go unprepared. These boards run their own show, he said. They'll try to intimidate you or twist the rules. Bring everything, photos, letters, video evidence, all of it. And if you can, record the meeting. Document everything. So, that's what I did. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at the community clubhouse, a small brick building with neatly trimmed hedges and a sign that read, Private Property, HOA Members Only. The irony didn't escape me. That morning, I wore a plain shirt, carried a binder full of printed documents, and tucked a small body camera inside my jacket. When I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. Neighbors were gathered in little clusters, whispering, glancing at me, then quickly looking away. I wasn't surprised. The forum post from the week before had already painted me as the neighborhood menace. Inside, the atmosphere was colder than I expected. 5 HOA board members sat behind a long folding table at the front of the room, papers neatly stacked in front of them. Lisa sat in the center, smiling faintly, her eyes sharp and unwavering. To her right was Greg, the same man who'd driven the excavator. He didn't look at me at all. The rest of the seats were filled with residents, some curious, others just there for the drama. I took a seat near the front, my binder in my lap. When the meeting started, Lisa's voice echoed through the room. We're here to address repeated violations by the homeowner at 114 Maple Ridge, she said, never using my name, as if stripping me of identity made it easier to target me. She listed each violation one by one: unauthorized landscaping, obstruction of drainage, failure to comply with maintenance directives, and accumulation of unpaid fines. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. Then she introduced a motion to approve foreclosure proceedings to recover the debt. That was my cue. When she asked if I had anything to say in my defense, I stood. My voice shook at first, but not from fear, from restraint. I started by stating that I had evidence, video evidence, showing that the HOA, under Lisa's direction, had trespassed and conducted unpermitted construction on my property. The room went still. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some wide, others skeptical. I held up printed screenshots. Lisa in her vest, Greg on the excavator, the HOA logo visible on their uniforms. I laid them on the table in front of the board, one by one, slow and deliberate. The faint sound of my pages sliding across the table filled the silence. Then I handed over a flash drive. "This contains the full footage," I said. Time-stamped, unedited. It shows everything that happened that morning, including the trenching, the cement dumping, and the lack of any city or county personnel on site. For the first time, Lisa's smile faltered. She shifted in her chair, whispered something to Greg, then looked back at me with forced composure. "These are serious allegations," she said carefully, "but this is not the proper venue to discuss them." I could tell she was trying to control the room again, trying to pivot. But it was too late. The neighbors were already murmuring, glancing between the board and me. I pressed on, pulling out a second document, the city inspection report. The city's zoning department has already confirmed that no permits were issued for the so-called drainage project, I said. And here's their order halting all HOA construction until further review. You violated municipal law, and you're using those violations as grounds to take my home. Greg finally looked up. His jaw tightened, eyes darting to Lisa like he was waiting for direction. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Lisa cleared her throat, trying to regain composure. "This meeting is adjourned until we can verify," but I didn't let her finish. "No," I said firmly. "It's not adjourned. Not until everyone here understands what you've done." And then I did something I hadn't planned. I pulled out my phone, opened the private YouTube account, and played the video directly on the screen. The sound of machinery filled the quiet room. On the screen, the HOA members appeared in broad daylight, giving orders, laughing, digging. Gasps spread through the audience. Someone muttered, "That's Greg," another whispered, "That's Lisa." Lisa stood abruptly. "This is out of order," she snapped. This video has been illegally recorded on private, but she stopped when Carter, the zoning official, stepped into the doorway. I hadn't expected him to come, but there he was, calm, professional, holding a clipboard. He'd come to observe the hearing after reviewing my case. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, addressing the board, "but I'm here on behalf of the county zoning office. We've confirmed multiple unapproved excavations conducted under the HOA's direction. The city will be issuing citations and potential fines pending review." The silence that followed was heavy. Lisa sat down slowly, her face pale. Greg looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The residents started whispering again, louder this time. The illusion of the HOA's authority had cracked, and once it cracked, it shattered fast. Carter continued, explaining that the city had suspended the HOA's approval to conduct any further maintenance projects until the investigation was complete. He also reminded them that filing false claims against a homeowner could result in civil penalties. I didn't need to say anything else. The footage, the documents, the witnesses, all of it spoke for me. By the time the meeting ended, the board members were silent. Lisa didn't look up once. Greg gathered his papers, avoiding everyone's eyes. The other residents filtered out in hushed groups, their curiosity replaced by unease. Outside, the air felt different. The same neighbors who had avoided me for weeks now looked uncertain, even apologetic. No one spoke, but their glances told me everything. They'd seen the truth. That night, I sat on my porch, the same spot where I'd once watched the trench being dug. It was still there, though partially filled now with rough concrete. It looked like a scar across the yard, a reminder of what they'd tried to do. I thought about posting the video publicly. Part of me wanted to hit upload and let the world see what an HOA could become when unchecked. But another part of me wanted to wait. The investigation wasn't over, and patience, I realized, was its own kind of weapon. For now, I'd let the evidence speak quietly in the right ears. I'd let the legal process unfold. Still, as I sat there in the dim porch light, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't finished. People like Lisa didn't back down easily. Power was an addiction, and the moment she felt it slipping, she'd do whatever it took to get it back. The HOA had been embarrassed publicly, and I had become the face of that humiliation. And I knew, deep down, that retaliation, the real kind, hadn't even started yet. For a few brief days after the hearing, the neighborhood was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like the pause before a storm. Lisa and the HOA board didn't reach out to me. No letters, no calls, not even a notice shoved under my door. It was as if they had gone dark, retreating into whatever shadowy corner they operated from. At first, I thought maybe it was over, that exposure and embarrassment had finally done their job. But deep down, I knew better. HOAs don't forgive, and people like Lisa don't forget. The first sign came the following Monday morning. When I opened my blinds, I saw a new sign staked at the edge of my property, bright yellow with bold black letters. Caution, unsafe property, pending inspection. At first glance, it looked official. Same kind of font the city used, even a logo printed in the corner. But when I looked closer, I saw the logo wasn't the city's. It was the HOA's. I went outside, took photos, and ripped the sign out of the ground. That small act felt good, defiant. But by the end of the day, 3 more had appeared. One near the driveway, another by my mailbox, a third planted right next to my hedge, as if mocking the very thing that had started this all. It was clear. They were marking my property as unsafe, hoping to turn my neighbors against me again. The next few days were a blur of petty harassment. I'd come home to find trash bags dumped near my hedge, anonymous complaint slips taped to my door, and flyers slipped into my mailbox about neighborhood safety hazards. None of them were signed, but I knew exactly where they came from. The final straw came on a Friday evening. I was reviewing footage from my security cameras, as had become my nightly ritual when I noticed something unusual. Around 11:45 p.m., a car rolled slowly past my house. Its headlights flickered, then turned off completely as it coasted to a stop. 2 figures got out, both wearing dark clothing and hooded sweatshirts. They moved quickly along the side of my house, staying low, heading straight for my backyard. One carried a small container. The other had what looked like a spray can. I felt that cold, sinking feeling in my gut, the kind that makes your hands tremble even before you understand why. They stopped near the hedge. One bent down while the other stood watch. Then a faint spark, a flicker of orange. They were trying to set it on fire. I shouted before I even realized it, slamming open the back door, the porch light blazing to life. The figures bolted instantly, sprinting toward the car. I managed to catch a glimpse of the license plate before they sped off, tires screeching. The hedge was scorched but not destroyed. The fire hadn't caught. I sprayed the area with water until the last ember was gone, then called the police. When the officers arrived, I showed them the footage. They took my statement seriously this time, marking it as attempted arson. The video captured enough detail that they could read the plate. But when they ran it, the car came back registered to a company vehicle. The HOA's maintenance division. That was no longer petty harassment. That was criminal. The next morning, I received an email from Lisa, short, formal, and infuriatingly smug. Please refrain from making unfounded accusations against the HOA or its members. Any further defamation will be met with legal action. We encourage you to resolve your outstanding compliance issues promptly. I stared at that email for a long time, my pulse pounding. They weren't just retaliating, they were doubling down, trying to turn the victim into the aggressor. But this time, I had leverage. I forwarded the footage and the email to Patterson, my attorney. Within hours, he filed for a restraining order against the HOA on grounds of harassment and property damage. He also reached out to the police department to submit the arson attempt as evidence of criminal misconduct. For the first time, the balance shifted. News travels fast in quiet neighborhoods. Within a few days, whispers spread like wildfire. People started realizing the HOA might not be the community guardians they pretended to be. Someone even leaked the hearing footage to a local blog, and from there, it caught fire online. Homeowner catches HOA digging trench around his property. The headline alone drew thousands of views overnight. The video spread faster than I could have imagined. Reddit threads, neighborhood forums, even a few local news outlets picked it up. Suddenly, I wasn't just a disgruntled homeowner. I was a headline. At first, I didn't want the attention. But then I realized it was my best defense. The HOA thrived in secrecy. The spotlight burned them alive. Within a week, reporters started showing up at the edge of the cul-de-sac. Cameras rolling, microphones ready, asking about the trench case. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, unsure what to believe. The HOA board tried to stay quiet, but the silence only made them look guiltier. Then came the next escalation. Late one night, just after midnight, I was woken by a loud bang. I rushed to the front door and found a rock lying in the middle of my porch. My window shattered. A note tied to the rock fluttered in the wind. It read, "You should have moved when you had the chance." I stood there for a long time, the sound of sirens echoing in the distance after I called the police. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind: the hedge, the trench, the hearing, the fire. Somewhere along the line, this had stopped being about property rules. It had become personal. The police started increasing patrols through the neighborhood, especially around my house. My cameras caught no new incidents for a few days, but I could feel the tension thick in the air every time I stepped outside. Neighbors who once ignored me now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Others whispered apologies, too afraid to do more. One family quietly took down their "Support the HOA" sign from their lawn. Small victories, I told myself. Then a letter arrived in my mailbox, not from the HOA but from the city attorney's office. It informed me that the county had officially opened an investigation into the HOA's finances and construction activities. Someone, likely Carter, had forwarded my evidence to them. It felt like a lifeline. The next day, 2 unmarked cars parked near the clubhouse. City officials, they spent hours inside, leaving with boxes of documents. I watched from my porch, feeling a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. The trench was still there, partially filled with rough cement, like an ugly reminder of everything that had happened. But for the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. That night, I sat under the dim porch light again, staring at the footage on my laptop, every clip, every frame that had started this mess. It was hard to believe how far things had gone, but one thing was certain: the HOA had made their move, and I had survived it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wasn't finished. People like her didn't crumble quietly. They regrouped. They plotted, and I had a feeling that whatever came next would make everything before look like a warm-up. The calm after the investigation began didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the center of a house of cards while the walls trembled. Everyone in the neighborhood knew something was happening, but no one knew when it would fall or who would get crushed when it did. In the days following the city's arrival, the HOA went silent again. No letters, no fines, no emails. Even the maintenance crews vanished, leaving overgrown sidewalks and uncollected trash bins behind. It was strange, almost surreal. The same board that once obsessed over grass, height and hedge symmetry had suddenly stopped caring about order altogether. But silence in this neighborhood was never a good sign. The first major crack came during the next community meeting, one I didn't even attend. I heard about it from my neighbor, Sam, who'd once sided firmly with the HOA. He showed up at my door the next morning, nervous but oddly apologetic. He told me that several residents had demanded explanations about the trench, the forged drainage notices, and the missing maintenance funds. Lisa had brushed it all off, claiming the documents were under review. But when someone asked where the HOA's financial statements were, the ones they were legally required to disclose, she froze. Apparently, the room turned on her. By the end of that meeting, half the board had resigned. I should have felt satisfied, maybe even vindicated. But all I felt was unease, because people like Lisa didn't just disappear when cornered. They doubled down. That night, as I sat at my desk reviewing my footage again, I noticed something strange. The HOA clubhouse lights were on, well past midnight. A car I didn't recognize was parked out front, engine idling. 2 silhouettes moved inside the windows, carrying boxes. It looked like someone was clearing the place out. I checked the next camera feed, the one angled toward the clubhouse parking lot, and zoomed in. One of the figures was Lisa. The other, from what I could make out, was Greg. They loaded box after box into the trunk, moving quickly, occasionally glancing over their shoulders. I started recording the live feed to preserve the footage. By the time they left, it was nearly 2 a.m. The next morning, the clubhouse was empty. The lights were off, the blinds drawn, and the front door padlocked. When the city investigators returned later that week, they found nothing inside. No files, no computers, not even the meeting logs. Just a few overturned chairs and some empty drawers. It was obvious Lisa had cleaned house. The news spread quickly. The HOA's bank account was frozen pending audit. The maintenance company, her brother's company, as it turned out, had its contract suspended for irregular billing practices. Neighbors began comparing notes, realizing they'd been overcharged for years. False landscaping fees, bogus improvement projects, missing funds. The community was imploding from the inside. I should have felt relief. After months of harassment, retaliation, and outright criminal behavior, the people responsible were finally being held accountable. But I couldn't relax, because every time I thought about Lisa, I remembered the look in her eyes during that hearing. Cold, controlled fury, and I knew she wasn't finished with me. The confirmation came 2 nights later. It was raining hard, wind thrashing against the windows, thunder rolling across the sky. I was sitting in the living room half asleep when I heard something outside. A metallic clang, then another. I checked the cameras automatically. At first I saw nothing, just the rain bouncing off the pavement. Then movement, someone near my side gate. I zoomed in. A figure in a raincoat, hood pulled tight. Too small to be Greg, too thin to be one of the maintenance crew. The person moved with purpose, crouching low, fumbling with the lock on my gate. I froze. The motion sensor light flickered on and the figure looked up, just for a split second. The light caught her face. Lisa. She was drenched, eyes wild, lips pressed into a tight line. She looked nothing like the composed woman who once presided over HOA meetings. She looked desperate. Before I could even react, she slipped through the gate and vanished around the corner of my house, toward the backyard. I didn't waste a second. I hit record on the camera feed and grabbed my phone. My first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped me. I wanted her caught. Yes, but I wanted proof, undeniable proof, of whatever she was about to do. I switched to the rear camera. There she was, moving toward the hedge again, the same one they'd tried to destroy before. She carried a small canister, maybe gasoline, maybe something else. I called the police then, whispering as I gave them my address. My heart pounded as I watched her crouch beside the hedge, her movements frantic and erratic. She poured something along the base, even in the rain. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a lighter. But before she could use it, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. She froze, turning her head sharply toward the flashing lights. I watched as she bolted for the fence, slipping, falling into the mud, scrambling back up before vanishing into the night. The police arrived minutes later. I met them at the door, breathless, showing them the footage. They searched the area but didn't find her. Still, the video was clear as day. The rain hadn't obscured much. Her face, her clothes, the canister, everything was visible. That footage became the final nail in her coffin. By the end of the week, the local news had picked it up. HOA president caught on camera attempting arson. The story went viral again, bigger than before. It wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was national news. Commentators dissected every clip, every frame of her trespassing and sabotage. And just like that, the HOA that once ruled the neighborhood with an iron grip collapsed overnight. The remaining members resigned, the bank froze their funds permanently, and the city officially dissolved their operating authority. The clubhouse was boarded up within a month, but for all the chaos and vindication, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Because Lisa was still out there. She'd been charged but released pending trial. And though she'd vanished from public view, I still caught myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I stepped outside, scanning the corners of my property for movement. The trench, by then, had been filled properly, courtesy of the city, who declared it unauthorized excavation. The soil was even again, the hedge trimmed, the lawn whole. On the surface, everything looked normal, but I couldn't unsee what had happened there. I couldn't forget the sound of machinery digging into my land, the smell of burned earth, the sight of my home surrounded by dirt like a fortress under siege. And though the HOA was gone, the damage lingered in ways paperwork couldn't erase. Neighbors avoided talking about it. Some still acted as if the HOA might return, as if speaking about it too loudly might summon it back. Others pretended it had never happened at all, but I knew the truth. I'd seen what power does to people when it goes unchecked, how it corrodes judgment, how it feeds on control. And every night when I checked my cameras before bed, part of me still expected to see that flicker of movement at the edge of the frame, because even though the HOA was gone, the paranoia they built around me never really left. The silence felt permanent now. Not peace, just aftermath. When the dust finally settled, the neighborhood looked the same. But it didn't feel the same. The lawns were still manicured. The fences still painted white, and the mailboxes still stood in neat little rows. But something invisible had cracked beneath the surface. The air carried that strange emptiness that follows after a storm, quiet, heavy, unsure. For years, our HOA had been the heartbeat of the subdivision. Controlling, nosy, relentless, but a heartbeat nonetheless. Once it was gone, there was only silence. No newsletters. No warnings taped to garage doors. No committee members prowling with clipboards at dawn. You'd think that would have been a relief. And in some ways, it was. But peace doesn't come easily after months of paranoia. Every sound outside my window made me tense. Every passing car felt like someone checking up on me. I still checked my cameras every night, out of habit more than fear. It had become routine, like locking the front door. The footage from that night, the one where Lisa tried to set fire to my hedge, had circulated for weeks. News stations, online commentary channels, even Reddit threads picked it apart frame by frame. People argued about motive, corruption, HOA laws, and homeowner rights. Strangers from across the country sent messages telling me I'd done the right thing. But none of that made the nights quieter. The city officially dissolved the HOA 2 months after the investigation concluded. The assets, what was left of them, were liquidated to repay stolen funds. Homeowners received partial refunds for bogus fees, though it was a fraction of what was taken. Lisa and Greg faced multiple charges: fraud, vandalism, trespassing, and attempted arson. When the trial finally came, I was called to testify. Sitting in that courtroom, watching Lisa at the defendant's table was surreal. She looked smaller somehow. The sharp suits were gone, replaced with a plain gray outfit. The confident smirk she used to wear at every meeting had faded. Her eyes darted around the room, unfocused, restless. When they played my footage on the courtroom screen, I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The jury did. And their faces said everything. She was sentenced to several years in prison. Greg, less involved but still complicit, received a lighter sentence. When the verdict was read, the tension I'd carried in my chest for months finally loosened, but it didn't disappear completely, because justice, I realized, doesn't erase fear. It just confirms it was real. The neighborhood tried to move on. Without the HOA, residents had to figure things out on their own. A few people formed an informal committee, strictly voluntary, to handle shared spaces and maintenance. It was small, friendly, and most importantly, transparent. For the first time, people actually talked to each other instead of reporting one another. Fences got painted cooperatively, lawns mowed as favors rather than duties. The air felt lighter. But for me, it wasn't easy to shake off everything that had happened. I found myself replaying moments in my head: the day they dug that trench, the sound of the machinery chewing into my land, the feeling of standing helpless while they acted as if it was theirs to destroy. I'd never forget that sight. The deep scar carved around my property like a warning. Even after the city repaired it, I still saw the outline when I mowed the lawn. The soil there was darker, softer. It looked the same, but I could tell where it had been. Sometimes I'd catch neighbors stopping to glance at it too, pretending not to look too long. We all knew what had happened there. It had become part of the neighborhood's unspoken history, a reminder that not all fences are meant to keep things out. Some are meant to keep power in. A few weeks after the trial, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. No return address. No handwriting on the front, just my name printed neatly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no words. Just a picture. It was a photograph of my house, taken from the street. The angle was familiar. Too familiar, because it was from the same spot where the HOA's trench began. I checked my cameras immediately. No unusual activity. No cars parked nearby. Nothing. Just the usual stillness of a quiet street at dusk. I tried to dismiss it. Probably someone trying to scare me, maybe even a neighbor who thought it was funny. But deep down, something about it felt deliberate. A week later, another envelope came. This one had a note inside, typed, no signature. It read, "You can't bury everything. That night I barely slept." I stayed up watching the camera feeds, one by one, waiting for movement that never came. Nothing happened. The street stayed quiet, the wind soft against the hedges, the world indifferent, but I knew what that note meant. It wasn't about the trench or the HOA, it was about the damage that lingers long after. The kind that seeps into your mind, not your property. Maybe it was someone connected to Lisa, maybe it was just a cruel prank. Either way, it reminded me that once a story like this leaves the walls of your home and spills into the world, you never really get to take it back. People remember. They revisit it. They relive it. And sometimes, they reach out just to make sure you remember too. A few months passed without another letter. The mail became ordinary again, bills, flyers, packages. Life settled into a fragile rhythm. I even began planting new hedges along the edge of the property, determined to reclaim what they'd tried to destroy. The soil there was still uneven. The roots resisted, but I persisted. Every time I watered them, I could almost feel the earth sigh beneath me, as if acknowledging what it had endured. Eventually, the hedges began to grow. Slowly, cautiously, but they grew. Neighbors would pass by, smile, and wave. Some still brought up the incident now and then, but in softer tones, like retelling an old legend that no longer hurt. The trench story, they called it, half-jokingly. I never corrected them, because while they saw it as a bizarre neighborhood drama, I saw it as something else, a warning. About how easily authority can twist into control, how quickly neighbors can become enemies, and how fragile peace really is when built on fear. One evening, as I stood on my porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, I caught a faint reflection in one of my cameras, the glow of the setting light glinting off the lens, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anxious. Those cameras, once my defense, had become a quiet reminder that truth, once seen, can't be buried. No matter how deep someone tries to dig, the HOA had tried to surround me, to isolate and intimidate me into submission. But they'd only succeeded in exposing themselves. Now the trench was gone, the ground restored, but the footage remained, safely backed up in multiple drives, stored far away. Proof that sometimes all it takes to bring down a system of control is a single camera pointed in the right direction. The story of our neighborhood faded from headlines, replaced by the next viral scandal. But for those of us who lived it, it never really ended. It just became part of the landscape, quiet, buried, but never forgotten. And as for me, I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is dig where you don't belong, because eventually the ground gives way. And that's how a simple trench exposed an entire web of corruption right in my own neighborhood. The cameras caught everything, and the truth buried the HOA deeper than they ever planned to dig. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned, because here at HOA Story Files, there's always another fence line hiding a secret.